He who was here is here.
Okay, so you're going to see some of the artists that were on the film. So we're going to start with Mel Lipsig, and appropriately, it's Michael Giaquinto and Liz. This is what Mel does. Mel divides his time between Trenton, New Jersey and Eastham. He is a portrait painter. However, look at his portraits. That's Selena Tree.
Can you put the lights up one little bit?
Yep, yep.
So we can take notes. Thanks. Not too much.
What do you notice about his portraits?
They're all,
They have all stuff in them.
they're all in context. They're not just-
Yeah, in an environment.
Yeah.
And that was what Mel wanted to do. And I can read you some of his. So these were environmental portraits. And his idea was to talk about the people, for example, Selena, through their environment. And even Mr. Haggerty, who is this one, when Mel went into decided he wanted to paint somebody's portrait, he said to them, don't clean up, just leave it the way it is. That helps, that tells you a lot about the person. Now, Gerald Haggerty, who is an art critic, I mean, look at his room and look at the, you know, how detailed Mel gets. You could see the fire escape and the American flag out the window, and all of this stuff, the paintings on the wall. I mean, it tells you something. Now, apparently, he doesn't ask people to change their room or get dressed or do anything. He just, and Haggerty said, well, can I pose in the nude? This is what Mel told me. And he said, no, no, no. So Haggerty put a robe on. But anyway, he said he feels that the identity of his subjects resonates in their surroundings with all of their stuff. Now he shot, I'm going to go back. Another painter, Linda, a good friend of his, in This Is Nappies. Now look at the distortions. He's a very accurate, but look at how he's distorted the angles of the room, the roof. He kind of does it from several different perspectives. It still works for me, but there is distortions. It isn't exactly accurate, but that's the way he paints. And so he said, I never did a non-objective painting in my life. I just wanted to paint the figure. But as you see, the person is always just, I think probably in this case, Liz and Michael are a larger part of the piece than some of his others, but still there are very small, what percentage are they of the space? And he felt very strongly that that's how he was going to do it. He said his work is about the space that contains the figure. He said, I'm very interested in how the room says something about the person. I'm mainly interested in creating space with a figure. It's the composition that thrills me. I want the viewer to feel he can be drawn into the room. I don't know if you feel that way, but I thought that's... And he said he's studied in a number of places, and he also taught. I think he's not teaching anymore, but he taught in New Jersey. art, and he said when he was studying, it was all about abstraction. And he said all the voices he heard from teachers in art schools was, that's what you have to do. And I love this quote. He said, you can end up losing your soul when you go to art school. Because he was going against the grain. And he says, I love packing the painting. I love complexity. He actually, I didn't have a larger image. I sent Benton, Mel actually painted me and my husband in our living room last summer, not this past summer, but the summer before. And we're like just tiny people sitting on a sofa. And he painted this, it's a big room, and he painted this room, and there was a, front of it was a coffee table, and I had a lot of little pottery stuff, and he was just painting it all so exacting. And then he decided he wanted to put my sons on the wall. So I gave him photographs, and he finished part of the painting, and then he took the photographs of my sons, and he copied them and put them in the dining room on the wall. And then he took 4 of my paintings and put them in the corners. I only had an image, and I sent it to Benton. He said it was pixelated, it was too small. But it was a really interesting experience to have I've never had my portrait painted, but it was painted, and it was pretty interesting to have that done.
How long did it take?
Well, what he did was he sketched out the room. And, you know, the living room has like cathedral ceiling, so great, he loved to do that. He sketched out the room, kind of blocked it in, and then we sat, I can't believe I did this, sat for 7 hours. And he painted us. Actually, my husband had a meeting, he had to leave early, so I had to, anyway, I sat for 7 hours, I can't believe I did it. And then he stayed in our house, had everything set up, he left, came back every day, and he spent a week painting the rest of the room. So we only had to sit for that one day, and then he started doing the room all around us, and with all these wonderful details. So it was interesting to watch him paint, and that 7 hours really went fast because he's a really very warm, friendly guy, and we got to talk to him, and it was great. And Mel's work is in like the Whitney Museum and Cooper Hewitt, the New Jersey State Museum, the Montclair Art Museum, and also the White House. So he's a pretty has a pretty significant reputation. Someone asked me if we bought the portrait, but we didn't because it was too expensive.
Do you remember when he painted that year and he did the same thing? He was set up for a week, and the people came in and loved it. People would stand and watch him for long because he was so engaging. So he could seem to do all this and talk. And
I sat there the whole time and we talked.
Yeah.
And he painted. It was great. It was really, so I really kind of got into Mel and learning a lot about Mel. And so anyway, the Haggerty painting I love, and that was in, there's also one of Robert Henry. He did both of them. He likes to paint artists or writers. And he did say to me that he only paints artists whose work he likes. So I felt very good about that. And he did put 4 of my paintings. I wish I had sent it to, it wasn't big enough. I didn't have a big enough. And actually I emailed Mel and I said, could you send me a high res? And I never heard back from him. So he's pretty interesting. Does the distortion bother you at all?
No.
It makes you pay more attention. He says that, and I think it does, because you know something's off, and you look more closely, you're looking into it more carefully, you're trying to adjust yourself to it, and it really just makes it more interesting.
And it's interesting that he does, no, we go back again, he does ceilings. And that kind of contributes to this distortion, but I think it works.
You know, did you say something about, he said it invites you in, they do invite you in, it's that axial kind of, you just kind of feel you're gonna walk into that
Yeah.
room.
You
That setting.
yeah, particularly when there's a longer, that one, where there's this long view, and you're kind of walking in and looking at all that clutter. I really like that painting a lot. Okay, and we got, and we know this upstairs, right? Penelope Jenks. She's a sculptor, and here's, this is there are a few pieces we have on loan, but this is Eleanor Roosevelt. It's a larger-than-life bronze. It's on Riverside Drive in New York City. I don't know if you've seen it, but I wanted you to. So she does a lot of public commissions as well as, you know, art that this one is pushing 40, and we could go up and look at it. It's and there is the maquette for Eleanor Roosevelt is in the sculpture course too, but the bronze is, as I said, it's in New York. She also has done a number of other public commissions. She did. Robert Frost is at Amherst College in Amherst, Mass. And Samuel Eliot Morrison, who is a maritime historian, is on, and a Harvard professor, he's on Commonwealth Avenue. These are terracotta figures, and again, they're larger than, if you see pushing 40, they're that size. Now what she was doing there, and what she was very interested in doing, is showing the natural, not glamorized. Now these figures are certainly not your glamorous model figures. You know, they have little bellies and, you know, they're a bit sagging, but she did a series of these terracotta figures. She was here as a child in the 40s, and her parents were kind of bohemian, and they would go on the beach au naturel. And as a little girl, she would be looking up at these figures that weren't always, you know, beautifully formed. So this was her inspiration for these later on. Again, this one is, and we could go upstairs and see the maquette that she took for it.
It's all grown in around here now. I mean, it's not, you can see it, but it's, the
Oh,
greenery
really?
is much
Oh, I haven't,
bigger.
they should trim it back, shouldn't they?
Yeah.
This is Claire Flanders, and she's a photographer. Interesting black and white here. She's, it is kind of interesting. This is like this simple meal that she set up, but with these oil sticks. Do you see them?
Mm-hmm.
So it was like nourishment, food, and art. I assume that's what she was thinking about. And then this one is Hopper's Studio. And it actually, and it's a really very simple photograph, but how the line, it reminds me a little bit of Hopper. The lines of the easel, and it is you know, kind of repeated in the window, the grills in the window, the hat. I think that's a beautiful, really beautiful photograph. Okay, so you saw Red Grooms a little bit. There was a picture of him in the film, and I did interview him. He had a small show at the museum. Anyway, this is Red, looking at Hopper, who is painting the the lighthouse. He did, Red Grooms did a series of these artist, kind of satiric, comical paintings. So this is the only one in the museum. But here's a typical painting of his. he's from, Red was from Tennessee. He came here, he was at the Sun Gallery. He actually did a class with Hoffman, but he found Hoffman just wasn't for him. And so he was part of that, and you saw the Sun Gallery opened in 1955, and the people showing there. If you remember, Alex Katz, there were some big paintings of, you know, figures, but big, kind of oversized. And he was there in the film, and he was part of the Sun Gallery, and this past summer, Colby College in Maine, Alex Katz gave his collection, or I think 400 pieces, to Colby College. And actually Pat and I went up to see it. It was really very interesting. Very large paintings, oftentimes portraits. And so he had started at the Sun Gallery. He was not anybody, but he became, in the mid-50s, he became he was just starting out. And the Sun Gallery was you saw Tony Vivers talk about it, they were rebels, and he said, with a cause, because they were challenging the abstract expressionists. They wanted to come back to figurative work, and they were, you know, it was a little different. So, and so was Red Grooms. Now, Red Grooms loved Manhattan, and he was almost, his paintings are almost like a tourist view of Manhattan, like the craziness. You see this in this painting, and then this is one of his walkthroughs, or called sculpto, he called them sculpto pictoramas. So this is, you could walk through it. You can't see it obviously here, but you know, it is a dimensional construction. And he did a lot of these. He was very well known for that. He was you know, he did those. He said he spent more time in hardware stores because he bought pine planks and fabric and fiberglass and styrofoam and insulation foam to make those kinds of what he called walkthroughs or sculpto pictoramas. He also thought that he's in major museums, but he was sensitive when I interviewed him too, because some people just think he's a humorist and not a real serious artist, but he was sensitive to that, but I'm not sure that I agree with that. I think he was pretty innovative.
Debbie, do you know of any museums that have those walk-into sculptures?
I know the museums, I can tell you where he is. He's at the Whitney and the Met and the Museum of Modern Art, but those walkthroughs are pretty big, so they may kind of disassemble them.
Right, they set them up.
And
They did
set
one at
them
the
up.
RCA in Boston
Oh, you
years
saw
ago.
one there?
Oh, I've seen them there and in New York.
Oh,
Yeah. But they, you know, he may disassemble them, and then, so you really, unless they had one on permanent.
And sometimes they had Rube Goldberg things going on in them. You could
Yeah.
get something rolling and it would fall here and set off lights.
Yeah,
and
he's
so
really,
forth.
really interesting. This is Roland Sherman, who is basically a journalist, photographer. He did photography for Life and Time and Playboy and National Geographic, and he was big on covering the musical cultural scene for them. He did the Newport Folk Festival, and that was when there was the auction. There was a photograph of Bob Dylan, which we could discuss. There's been, you know, him getting the Nobel Prize for Literature. But there was a really nice photograph of him that was at the auction this year here. It's not here, it's not part of the collection. This is the top of the Cape Cinema right here. And I think it's an interesting how he's just did that top. I thought I really like that. And these are Cape things that are in the collection. That's Provincetown. There's the dunes. This this is a photograph. It looks to me like a painting though,
It does.
doesn't it? So these are all in the collection. The only grooms we had in the collection is the hopper to the lighthouse. The other two I wanted to show you were not. And we don't have the best. These are Joel Meyerowitz's pieces. That we don't have the best of Joel's work. This was, there's several of them we have. It was a collection, Preservation of Wilderness in New York City Parks. I'll show you them quickly. That's a really nice one. But this is, I have a couple that which are not in our collection. So those you saw are in the collection. This is from his Cape Light series. And Meyerowitz is a New York photographer. He started out kind of in the tradition of Henri Cartier-Bresson, doing street photography. He came to the Cape in 1976, and he became enamored with, like so many artists, with the light. I interviewed Joel, I don't know, numerous times. The first time was probably back in the 80s, after Cape Light it's a beautiful book, and he had an exhibit at the MFA of that work, and I can show you how he dealt with the light. There's you kind of look through that and you almost see like it's endless. There was another, this is a beautiful one of, he did this porch in a, different light. And he also did another Provincetown-based book and series of photographs called Bay Sky, where he would sit on the, he had rented houses on the water, on the bay, and a series of summers. And he would shoot the bay in various lights and in, low tide, high tide. I don't have any of those images. It would be great if the museum could secure some of the Cape Light ones, because they're really beautiful. But he had some interesting things to say. He was, we don't have that one. I guess we didn't. Oh, there it is. He did a whole, he was on the Cape when 9/11 happened. And he was a New Yorker, he needed to get back to New York because he wanted to document the cleanup. And he rushed back to New York. And a week later, he was back in Provincetown. And there was a party at Norman Mailer's house, and he was there. And he was talking about what he saw there and how he was trying to get permission, it was really pretty restricted, to get in there and kind of document the cleanup. And so much, and he produced a book. The book is called, let's see, it's called, oh, yes, Aftermath, the World Trade Center Archive, which was, he shot 8,500 pictures, and 1,000 of them are installed at the Museum of the City of New York, so they have, and he got permission through the Museum of the City of New York to get in there and document the cleanup. And he said the exhibition, then there were exhibitions that were sponsored by the State Department that were seen in 90 countries. He finished the book in, I think, well, sometime in the mid, 3 or 4 years after he got it all together. And it's a big book. But he's primarily known for these wonderful Cape Light photos. And he said some interesting things about photographing the Cape that I think I'll share with you. He said, the Cape is very different. It's not like the scenery out west, like the Grand Tetons, or it's not Venice or Yosemite. It's not grand. He said, it's very simple. And he said, there's nothing of any magnitude here, meaning the Cape. And he said, the mountains, the grandness, they're too much of a given. They're too easy to photograph. You can't go wrong photographing the gorgeous mountain or, the Grand Canyon or whatever, because it's so monumental. So he thought it was a bigger challenge to photograph a porch or a clothesline or the little cottages along as you come into Provincetown. That to him was a challenge, and this is what he said. If there's too much there, like the Tetons or some of these magnificent places out west, he said if there's too much there, you're just a recorder, just copying nature. I prefer to invent. But he knew also that taking a picture was just taking a picture. He said, but he said he didn't need the Parthenon. He said a dinky bungalow, like the ones along Cape Cod Bay, were all he required. He said they have color, scale, presence. And he said, I'm trying to find what spirits me away, ordinary things. So he did these beautiful Cape books, and then he did the World Trade Center, which was kind of going back to his street photography, where he started out. And he said some interesting things about this. He said, it's 110 stories collapsing into metal. It's so sharp, so hard, so brutal, a devastating image. He said, but despite the horrors of the scene, the efforts of the workers were dazzling. 2,000 people working in the best American can-do spirit. He was really impressed with the effort to find the remains of the people who died there. He said it represented to him the value of the individual in American society. So anyway, he went from doing these very quiet Cape to this jumble of it where you can get a sense of what's happening there. The frame of the, which of course is no longer, if anyone's been there recently. This is, Sam Barber, who's going to have a show here soon, opening. Local artist, obviously, who was he influenced by? The Impressionists, right? And he's pretty much continued that way. And he paints the local scene, and he travels and paints, and we have both of those in the collection. This piece by Jim Peters, I don't know, do we have any others? Yes, we do, good. This is the piece that we have in the collection, and the story of this is kind of interesting. Let me go back. We only had, when Dee Dee and I were working on the book, we only had a small little etching. Very typical of what Jim does, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And Dee Dee said, I don't know if I want to include this in the book. It's small, it's not really particularly important. But he said, well, Jim Peters is important. So a few of the paintings that we have, I was able to make some connections and encourage people to make those donations. And I know Jim very well. I interviewed him, I don't know how many times, but from the mid-'80s. And he's now in North Adams, and I didn't think, it was such a rush to get the book together. But Angela sent him a release because we had to have permission to reproduce the image for the book. And when Jim got the release, he got in touch with the museum and said, I'd be happy to donate a larger piece to the museum, and this is what he donated, which is very typical of Jim's work. He's, the nude figure dominates. I'm not sure I've ever seen any of his paintings where the figure has clothes on. And he does these dark, so this is the one in our collection. He does these dark rooms, and some of them, when he puts a man in there, they become very erotic. I first interviewed Jim in 1985, and he was just finishing up fellowship at the Fine Arts Work Center. But he had been selected from a field of 2,000 artists, one of 9, to be in a New Faces exhibition at the Guggenheim. And he tells this really great story, because he went to the opening. I don't have that note down, but I'll see if I can remember it. He told me this really great story about he was going, and he, you know, Jim is just kind of very earthy guy. You saw a picture of him, and he was toward the end of him painting that very large, again, nude, and that was probably 85. And so he figures he has to go get a jacket and a shirt and a tie to go to the opening of this Guggenheim exhibit that he's going to be in, and he gets to the truck because he didn't have a jacket, I guess he didn't have a tie, whatever. He went and got it, and he went there and he said he was the only one with a jacket and tie, the only artist with a jacket and tie. And Jim started out as a, he was in the field of science. He was a, let me see, he has a bachelor's degree in atomic physics from the U.S. Naval Academy and a master's in nuclear engineering from MIT. And then he decided he wanted to be an artist. And he studied at the Maryland College of Art and then came to Provincetown, where he was for many years. As I said, I interviewed him in 1985, probably once or twice. He left Provincetown again because, as you saw in the film, real estate got expensive, moved to upstate New York with his family, was there a few years, but felt really that there was no connection to the art colony and everything that he loved about Provincetown. So he moved back and he built his own house in Truro, and he was there for a while. And he was there for a while. He got divorced, remarried, and now he's in North Adams, but he still comes back to Provincetown, and he teaches often at the Fine Arts Work Center. So anyway, he was, let me just read a few of his quotes about why he paints what he paints. Again, the nude figure, and he does that because he sees the nude figure showing a vulnerability. And he likes these small, shabby rooms because, I mean, if we look at this one, he said he likes them. He said he sees them as, to me, they're a romantic space. They're functional, but to me, they're very small and claustrophobic. That's how when I look at them. But I'm also the person that wouldn't go into live in a dune shack, so I guess Jim might. His obviously the sexuality, particularly, and you can see it in this one, is very strong, and it's very erotic in many cases. And he said he uses these nude figures to increase the vulnerability. Each painting to me, he says, is like a short story, and yet is not an obvious story because I don't think the emotions between men and women are obvious. There are so many different ins and outs to a relationship. There's intellectual and sexual. And also, he talked about some of the other feelings: loneliness, jealousy, companionship, separation, tenderness, tension. He said, I like my paintings to deal with tenderness and love and still have an edge of tension. And when you look at that, Someone want to talk about it? I always feel like it's voyeuristic, like you're invited, you're kind of a voyeur, looking at a very intimate space or relationship. And there's this one, and there's a funny story here. This one, it's not clear, I don't know if you can see it here. Yes, you can, I'll have to point it out to you. Anyway, they chose this when I did this book, the Provincetown book. He was in it, and they chose, there were 3, on each volume, there were 3 photographs, or 3 images, paintings. And they chose this one on the cover. And they sent me copies of the cover, and I looked at it, actually it was on my refrigerator. So I thought, oh, well, you know, that's Jim, and it's a nude body, and it's quite nice. And it says, whose dream is this, are the words.
Mm-hmm.
Whose dream is this? And then I kept looking at it, and all of a sudden, and I don't know if you can see it. Can you see what I see?
Is that blood?
What?
I immediately, this will sound very juvenile, but I thought behind her head, maybe because it's painted in red, that suggests, to me it suggests blood. So I'm saying a possibly violent scene.
What's up in the right?
Well, no. Behind her head, right around her head, above the red, is an erect penis.
Okay.
Wait a minute, wait a minute.
Can you see it?
Oh,
Yeah, I can see it now, yeah.
yeah.
Well, that hung on my refrigerator for a long time.
Oh my God.
And then I said,
Yeah, I see that.
and it's much more obvious in, you know, this is not, it's much more obvious. But I didn't see it right away, and finally I saw it, so I called my editor and I said, are you sure it's one thing to have it inside the book. I said, are you sure you want this on the cover? And I don't know if he noticed it, and so he said, well, let me check, and he checked with Pete Schiffer, who owns the company, was a man, and I guess the designer of the book, who had picked it, and was also a man, and they said that was fine, so it stayed on the cover of the book. But you know, it's not, you know, the woman's body is what dominates that. He said he works on, and if you saw that piece he was working on in the film, he does a lot of, there's a lot of texture, and when we go upstairs we'll see it. He does a lot of scraping and kind of, not violent, but a lot of activity on that canvas. The figures are quite beautiful, but there's a lot of texture, and I think that's how he builds up the tension, even in a single figure. And it's a pretty big painting. We'll see it upstairs. I think you'll get a better sense of it. But he said some interesting things about art, and he said, I'm not professionally proactive. He said, the art world is a very crazy, complex machine, and it operates on trends and fashions controlled by museums and curators. He said the craziness, it's the whole art scene. And he said you can't take it very seriously. You take art seriously. Making the paintings is serious, but after they leave the studio, there's just so much luck, good fortune, or bad fortune. And then I loved what he said about Provincetown. So I'm going to read you a couple paragraphs because you really get a sense of how he felt about it. He said, it's still crazy and wild, and it's always billed as sort of edgy to some degree, but money has changed it, just made it harder for the counterculture to come here. Now it's more edgy because of the party scene. People come here for their 2 weeks or have their condo, and it's time for play. I think P-Town is more carnival now than it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago. But the ocean and the dunes will always make P-Town attractive. just to walk through the dunes, go to the ocean, just to look 210 degrees and see nothing, just the pounding of the ocean, and just realize you're a peon. And there are all these forces here, and what do you want to do with it? Write about it, paint it, or just suck it in and go back and be a lawyer? And I think he really expressed why people come here, you know, or come to Provincetown. And he loves Provincetown. He's in North Adams now. He has Massamoka nearby, and there's an art community there. But I know he's very tied to Provincetown. Oh, here's another one. There's Jamie Wyatt. He is, that's the only piece we have by him, but, and I downloaded, okay, so here are some of the other pieces. He actually worked with Andy Warhol at his factory. I don't want to talk about these in a minute, but I just showed him. This, he did a whole seven deadly sins series, these goals in Maine. So, of course, we know he's, okay, go back. Go back to the dogs. He painted that, this is his Labrador Retriever, and he painted that, it's called Kleberg, and Kleberg and Dozer are the painting that's in the collection. And he painted with a circle around the eye and he drew that circle in the dog. And he said it reminded him of Pete the Pup from The Little Rascals. And the mark remained there for the rest of the dog's life. So that's the story of that painting. I interviewed Jamie when he had a show last year at last summer at the Heritage. His father, Andrew, and Nancy Wyatt, there was a group of their paintings at the Heritage. And I interviewed him at that time. He, as you know, came from this family of artists. NC was primarily an illustrator, but I don't know how many people saw that show, but I was really engaged by NC Wyatt's paintings, although he's considered primarily an illustrator. He's a wonderful painter. Jamie, his grandfather died before Jamie was born, but he actually studied with an aunt art in his grandfather's studio, and his grandfather had all these props because he was an illustrator and a lot of his work was historic. So he had these props and costumes, and he said it was very exciting. I felt the spirit of my grandfather. I was reliving Robin Hood and Long John Silver. It was a whole world unto itself. And then I'd walk down the hill to his father's studio, and he was painting a dead crow. So this was Jamie's experience, and after 6th grade he was homeschooled and studied art. And he said everybody in his, he had, Carolyn Wyatt was an aunt. He said everybody in his family painted except the dogs. And then the dogs got into the painting. He was very engaging. He was really fun to talk to. And this is an example of his work. These pieces were in the, that was obviously, and there's an interesting, you know, both Warhol and Jamie painted representational work, very different. And he spent some time in New York at Warhol's factory. And this is more typical. I mean, the goals are a little departure. I mean, this one, for example, and this one look a lot like his father's work.
Yes.
Very subdued, melancholy, very subtle colors. But when he did this series on goals, I mean, look at the paint. It's much more expressive. I think he kind of found his own niche. And these, there were paintings of these goals, and he called them the 7 deadly sins, and you see them swooping down to grab a fish, and one is called gluttony. I mean, there's the 7 deadly sins. So it's kind of interesting that he has no connection to the Cape. And the museum got that piece from a donor, obviously, who had the painting. And when he was at the museum, at the MFA, for his show, I was at the press opening, and so I asked him if he knew Rockwell Kent, because when he goes to Maine, he lives in Rockwell Kent's house. So I said, do you know the mural at the Cape Cinema? And he said, well, he's seen pictures of it, but he's never been there. But he has a collection of Rockwell Kent's work, so he's an admirer of Rockwell Kent. But the goals, I think, put him in a little different, separates him a little bit more from his dad in these kind of, I mean, look at the brush stroke and compare that with that, which is so exacting, or the Kennedy portrait. That's a little freer. So obviously the man has amazing talent to do that. But then you could see a little growth in moving away from the family traditions with the goal. And that there were, I think, a few goals at the Heritage. This is Mary Louise Hutchison, and there's a connection because she's influenced by Wyeth, and she divides her time between Yarmouthport and Maine, and in an area where Andrew Wyeth used to summer. And so there is this connection, different style, but the subject matter, that's in the collection, and then I downloaded 2 more. Not one, there's only one here, but anyway. And this is very typical of her work, and this piece is very representative. And I asked her about the abstract elements. Look at those roof lines, those angles. And we talked about the diagonal before with Donald Stoltenberg and how, although this is very quiet, with all those wonderful roof lines, there's a sense of, I don't know, does someone get that? Kind of that angular. Her scenes are always quiet. She's very, she paints scenes out of the 19th century. And she said to me, and she loves New England, and she was born in Massachusetts, and she said to me, I don't know, because she divides her time, and somehow we got to talking about Florida, and she said, if I had to paint Florida, I'd kill myself. So she's very much into this very quiet, serene areas, and actually she doesn't find those houses hardly at all on the Cape. She usually finds them in Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont, and she says that she's lots of times the houses she will sketch or photograph and comes back to the studio and paints, but she says lots of times she'll find she'll kind of re-renovate some of the houses have been renovated in a way that took away their original authenticity. So she will, you know, take them back when she can to their original. She often has flags. But look at those roof lines. I'm very kind of attracted to the roof lines. This is Hilda Neely. And did I get another one by her? Yes, this is more typical. She, for a long time, studied with Henshey. And she was one of the few artists I talked to who absolutely adored Henshey. And she paints exactly like Henshey would have wanted all of the students to paint. And they're really beautiful paintings, lots of light, kind of ethereal. The only one we have in the collection is this one, but I wanted you to see what was more typical of her work. Okay. Now, we've seen this upstairs. This is Mike Wright. Actually, Mike Wright spoke to my class in Wellfleet yesterday. So she is kind of in the tradition of a lot of Provincetown creating sculpture from found objects. She studied with Paul Bowen, and we have his work, and we'll see that upstairs too. So she studied with Paul Bowen, and Paul Bowen only collects unpainted fragments of wood. They scavenge the beaches for a lot of what washes ashore of the beach. From old boats, an old deck, things that, you know, in a storm. So, but Paul only collects unpainted wood, maybe with some white, and maybe occasionally some black. Mike only collects painted wood. And she feels like she's kind of an archaeologist, although she's putting them together in abstract ways. She had a show here about a year ago. This is after Blanche Lazelle. The only piece we have in the collection is this one, the one I just showed you. And that's a ski, a water ski. This one is, she's very influenced by some of the Cubist or Cubist-oriented artists, this being Blanche Lazelle. Another one is Kenneth Stubbs, William Freed, and this is after a painting by Blanche Lazelle, and very Cubist. So she collects all this wood, and she doesn't change the color. It's the original color. She doesn't, you'll see it upstairs, she doesn't clean it up very much. Sometimes she recuts it, and I would imagine most of the time she is recutting it. And sometimes she's using it exactly how she found it. And she's doing a lot of layering, which is what Blanche Lazelle did in her painting. This is after a painting by William Freed, I think. And she found this, you know, she tells these wonderful stories about where she finds this stuff. She only collects in Provincetown. And she's very concerned that the work, I don't know, do we have any other pieces? No, there's Paul. Okay. So she's very interested that although the work is abstract, and I think we'll talk about that with Paul, it holds the history of what it once was. An old deck that got destroyed in a storm that gets washed up, or a lot of the barrels or paraphernalia from the fishing industry. She also goes around town. She has a truck, she goes around town, and there's a lot of renovations in town. She did a lot of, when they renovated a Motherwell's house, there was a big dumpster there, and she was able to take a lot of stuff out of the dumpster and take it into her studio and use it for various other pieces. She's amazed that, for example, here's Robert Motherwell's house, and whoever bought it is kind of, the outside remains the same, and I guess there's some historic requirements, but the inside, and she said all of this wonderful blue, which was one of Mother-in-law's favorite colors, and he had all kinds of blue painted wood, was all pulled out and was in the dumpster in front of the house. So she goes and asks permission if she can take it, and they usually say, sure, take it off her hand. I mean, she talked about that she found this big dresser or an armoire, I think it was, and it was painted orange. She said it was really ugly, but so she went to the owner, and it was outside, and she went to the owner and she said, can I take it? And he said, you can take the whole thing, but everything in it. And it was stuffed with stuff. So I guess she schlepped it back to her house in Provincetown and cut it apart. And a lot of the work that's orange is from this particular, I think it was an armoire. She was telling the story yesterday. Is really. Mike says she studied art education, and she taught for art in elementary school for a number of years. She had first come to Provincetown when she was 15, and she said there was something magical about the town, and she said, I want to come back one day, and she did. And she and her partner were owners of a B&B, and then her partner took over the business in 1990, which is like 25 years ago. She studied with Paul Bowen, and she said she knew that this was what she wanted to do. She wanted to collect these fragments of wood, colored, painted wood, and create her, abstract sculpture. And she says, I'm an archaeologist using wood with its peeling paint chips and grooves as evidence of what it was. The memory of what it was is there, and I bring it forward into different configurations.
Will she go in and touch up at all? Or?
No.
Just
No,
completely
and
related.
when we go upstairs, you'll see, no, she won't. She will cut the wood and shape it to create it, but she doesn't deal with the paint. She wants it there. She says it has to have the patina of its previous use with all the nicks and broken edges and gritty fragments that make up and that's very important to her. So no, she doesn't touch it up. And you'll see that particularly upstairs.
Look at how she has created the white line. In
Yes.
Following.
Yes.
Blanche.
And she talked about the wood that she found that did that, but yes. But that painting by Blanche was a painting, it's not a white line woodcut.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And that painting is at Pan. They have it in their
Yes.
collection. But it is a painting, not a woodcut.
Interesting.
Okay. How are we doing? Because we want to go upstairs. It's 20 after 2. We started earlier, right? So we should have plenty of time. And well, let's see where we are. So here's Paul. And this piece is upstairs. I think, yeah, this piece is upstairs. And you'll see it, the ball comes out. Okay, so Paul grew up in Wales, was in an area, Colwyn Bay in Wales, which was also on the water, and so was very interested. He said it was a Victorian seaside resort. Again, I interviewed Paul a number of times. Got to know him pretty well. He was in Provincetown till 2005, and then he moved to Vermont. Again, I think a lot of it has to do with the price of real estate and living there. He was a fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center. He comes back to Provincetown to teach. He's still very connected, although he lives in Vermont now. So he grew up in Colwyn Bay in Wales. He came to Provincetown with a fellowship at the Fine Arts Work Center in 1977, and he lived there until 2005. And what he does, he says he searches for wood that has been worked. And he said, there's a vast amount of material out there, but I am very selective. I collect all kinds, he said, but it has to be either stained or white painted, or sometimes with rust on it. And again, he doesn't reclaim the wood. He uses the wood, he cuts it and shapes it, but he uses the wood as he finds it. And that's very important to him. And he said he will modify the pieces in terms of shape, but not in, you know, not, and I guess that's, these two are in the collection. And it's just, so the circle, and there's the big piece outside the museum, which is also a circular piece with slats of wood extending. And the circle is very, very, a strong focus of his work. Whether he actually has a circle or creates a circle like he did with this, with boards of wood. And I once asked him why, and he said, well, part of it was he would find these pieces, these drums and things from the fishing industry on the beach where he scavenged. But then he said, which was really funny, he said, he turned his head down and he has this bald spot, and he said, I guess that's why. You know, artists find something that engages them, and then he repeats it again and again. He, because he said he was finding these cable drums and other circular debris, so that's kind of how it started. And you know, he does a lot of work in the studio. He's the Windrush 2 is outside the museum, and when we go out, we can take a look at that, how that. He also does, and these two pieces are in the collection, plus the piece outside. He also does these drawings and paintings, again, connecting to the sea, very simple. Oh, we have it here. There it is. So you see, there's another one. Okay. So you see the circle, and then he pulls out the wood. He said this piece is the only piece that he ever bought wood. He said he bought it from where was it from? A beer distributor, Narragansett Brewery. He said it's made from redwood and mahogany, and the redwood came from the Narragansett Brewery beer vats. It was one of the rare occasions I actually bought wood. But the circle is there, and there it is again. With this, and he's created the circle with these strips of wood, as he did there. So here we have Mike Wright, Paul Bowen doing some really abstract work. And the book is chronological. We did it by date of birth. So we have Mike, who was actually, I think, a year older, or a couple of years older than Paul. And then, but this is another piece by Paul that's, he does these kind of small pieces like shells and not circular. And then we have Bill Davis, who goes back a century. Same generation. Bill was born in 1952. Paul was born in 1951. Bill Davis is a marine artist, primarily. He also does some landscape work. He grew up in Hyannis. He took sailing lessons at the Hyannisport Yacht Club. And so his interest in sailing and marine painting goes back to the 60s, but his paintings themselves go back 100 years. He's very interested in the 19th century schooners and square riggers and clipper ships and steamboats and cutters and these look like the artists, the Luminist artists that painted in the 19th century, and he's very influenced by them. So he paints from, he doesn't paint from life, obviously. He has a lot of books with these boats, and he's essentially self-taught. He studied art maybe at Barnstable High School, but he essentially self-taught, so he's just a natural painter. Paints these pristine, very nostalgic views of a bygone era and boats that sailed the seas or, you know, the waters in a very different time. And they're beautiful and pristine, but compare them to what Mike Wright is doing and what Paul Bowen is doing, and they're, you know, they collect wood and fragments from the sea, from the fishing community, and build abstract art. And Bill Davis does something entirely different. He takes us back. Artists like Martin Johnson Head and Fitzhugh Lane, it was the Luminist tradition in the 19th century, so he was very influenced by that. Oh, here's another one. Oh, and here's one of his landscapes with some boats back there. He likes to go, he paints these in his studio in Harwich. And here you see it almost silhouette against this light. And then when he goes out, he does these plein air. And he's obviously a very skillful painter, and I guess there's a painting they're going to, people are taking raffle tickets or whatever they call it. Yes.
I've heard that of the painters who are probably painting on the Cape, that his are the most valuable, you know, in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Probably.
He sells them online. You know, when I interviewed him, he will sell. There are collectors who want these paintings. He could sell them, depending on the size, for $40,000 or $50,000. Which is what he told me. So, they're obviously take a lot of time to paint, but he's very proficient, and he uses these books that he has as models for the boats that he wants to paint. We saw these down here, right? This is Thomas Barbie, and he creates these really surreal. I mean, here's this tree with these trolleys, and how he does it, he doesn't Photoshop. He uses the old way of doing it. He sandwiches negatives. He co-prints them simultaneously. He deals with double exposures. He will create collaged photographs that he rephotographs, and this is called Tourist Track. And this is in the collection, and this is called Crash Course in Italian. And his paintings are, they're photographs, I'm sorry, are so different. I mean, here, you know, it's falling off this waterfall that you know it's not possible. There's a photograph skiers going down an aisle, I think a church aisle. And there's one of, what was the other one that I didn't get? A gondola gliding down the aisle, gliding down the aisle of a cathedral, and surfers riding the wave in the middle of the city, and skiers across a bank of snow that turns out to be a white tablecloth. They're really, you probably could go online. I went online and saw some of them. They're really quite surreal. And he's in like, he's in like major museums. This is, let me see, do we have anything else? Yes, we could. So this is the only piece we have of Tabitha Beavers. Tabitha was, or is the daughter of Elspeth Halverson, who did those boxes, and Tony Beavers, who you saw on the film. Tony Beavers had that handlebar mustache. He was the born in the UK, and during the Blitz, during World War II, he was sent to Connecticut to get out of danger, and he served in the Army during World War II, and taught at Purdue. And he and his wife Elspeth bought Mark Rothko's house in the 50s. And I think I mentioned before, I was interviewing Elspeth and Tabitha and at their house, and Elspeth said, well, you're sitting on Mark Rothko's sofa. So when they bought the house, apparently they bought the furniture, and she said she kept it because it was Mark Rothko's sofa, and Mark Rothko was obviously very famous, and she said, I did reupholster it, but the sofa is the same. Anyway, Tabitha grew up with her parents as artists, and she grew up in Provincetown, and she said, as a child, I internalized the water and the beach. The beach was my sandbox, and the water was always present. The water is a major element of my work, which is not in this series that she did, a dreamlike series. It's one series, but it's not more typical of her work. And the seaside is important, and let's just look at, this is the only one we have in the museum. This is called Shiva. Tabitha is very interested in, do we have the other one? Yeah. Very interested in feminist issues and the environment. And this is something about rape. When we talk about rape. And it's a small work, and it's painted, oftentimes she uses gold leaf, very exacting. And it's a depiction of, obviously, a mermaid whose fishtail is ripped apart. And she said people tend to romanticize mermaids and see them as sirens or sexual objects. I was trying to find a way to visually depict a crime that usually goes unseen, showing the violation. And that's a pretty strong image. She said, coming of age as an artist in the 70s, I had the desire to take the female figure back from art history. There were very few women artists in the past, but there were endless pictures of nude women. I wanted to paint the female nude from a woman's point of view. So her work is really very meticulous. This one is Shiva, and here this figure is riding a lobster, but it's really about the environment and the smokestacks. So there's an erotic and this is mostly when I think of, and I think this is some of her best work. She are these kind of social political paintings that represent more than just the image itself. She's, again, wants to take the, paint from a feminist point of view. She is married to Dan Rinaldi, who is a professor. He's also an artist, a photographer, and he's at Boston University, heads up the arts administration program, I think there. And they have a place in Cambridge, and they have a house in Wellfleet. And she, spent summers growing up here. This is called Shiva. This was a series called Shiva Exodus. And she said, this image deals with my environmental concerns of global warming, which is the subtext of some of my newer work. And then she said, she likes to work small, and oftentimes she paints on clamshells, so that's how small she works. And she said, I like to play with the delicacy and beauty of the way the paintings are executed and the edginess of the subject matter. Having a little tension between the two elements is part of the work. I try to seduce people into looking at them closely. And that's one of the reasons her work is small. She wants people to go and look in and kind of develop a dialogue, more or less, that can really look at the work very closely, because it's generally small. This is Joe McGurl, landscape painter who, do we have Donald Beal here? I see further on. Yeah, there's Donald. Okay, this is Joe McGurl. That painting is upstairs. That's the only piece in our collection. He's basically a landscape painter who really likes to get involved, and he paints plein air because he wants to really get into the whole nature thing. And then he often will do sketches or take the painting back and finish it. So he paints kind of, pretty, unlike Meyerowitz, he likes to go out and paint these Western subjects. We only have this one, which is upstairs. So he's a landscape painter, and he says a lot of it is about, this one is called Bleach, and he said it's about recreating a three-dimensional space and a sense of distance on a two-dimensional surface. So he spends a lot of times doing oil sketches outdoors, but usually comes back to the studio to finish the painting. And he's, pretty exacting, as you can see. And this is, and that's upstairs. They're actually small. Donald Beal. He lives in Provincetown, and when he first came there, he really wasn't, so many painters in Provincetown are attracted to the harbor, but he didn't find that particularly interesting. And so he went into the Beechwoods forest, and he painted these works that, this is a triptych, and it's small. But here are a few other pieces that are not in the collection. So Donald is kind of interesting because he starts with, he paints from memory for the most part. He doesn't go out there, other than in the beech forest. He will paint there. But his work, pretty close to abstract, would you say? Mm-hmm. Lots of texture. One of his heroes, he says, is William de Kooning. He paints from memory. He paints Provincetown in northern Maine, where he grew up as a child. Actually, there's a Beale Island, he said. And he said memories of these places nourish my painting. And he says, when he goes into a studio and confronts a blank canvas, he said, I have to dig up something to respond to. I'm reinventing. I often have no idea where I'm going. I can't work toward a concept, like Tabitha does, okay? I mean, he didn't say that, I'm saying that. My paintings are accidents. I just wait for something to assert itself. He said he simply starts by making a mark on the canvas. I don't know, it could have been that yellow flicker, figure, I don't know, okay? And the painting grows from, he said that mark will demand a response. And the painting grows from there. It builds out of relationships between the shapes and colors eventually into a representational image. But then he said, as he moves forward in his work, he sometimes finds he's looking at a non-objective painting. And if you take that, what looks like a figure, and look at just the top half of that, it looks like an abstract expressionist painting. But he said, so he sometimes finds he's looking at a non-objective painting as he's working. And he said that doesn't satisfy him. So he proceeds with the painting until it suggests something. There's something about an image that you can recognize that is important to me. I let go of too many things when I lose the image. I'm not consciously trying to make an image, but I'm sure that these paintings come from somewhere important and that my subconscious is hard at work. This too helps me avoid preconceptions and allows something elusive to come into my painting. He said it's all intuitive. But he needs the subject, although he just paints from marks. Lots of texture. You'll see it upstairs. They're small, the beech forest ones, these that we have. They're a triptych. These happen to be some of my favorite pieces, and he's done a whole series. And they're really very nice. And when you look at that, if I didn't say beech forest, what would you say? Looks like trees?
Trees. Reflection. Trees.
Okay, we're almost there.
Oh, that's true.
These are right outside. They're part of these Kahn and Selesnik, Nicholas Kahn and Richard Selesnik, who work together. They're photographers, and they do these what they call narrative photo novellas. I don't know them. I've seen some of their work. A lot of their work is installation work. I think it's conceptual. There are these two faces that are covered with, so I suppose they're saying something about the environment. They're called the Green Men series, but if you can explain it to me. You know, you get to some work and you say, okay, kind of interesting, but it doesn't really speak to me. And
Green Man is a pagan symbol.
What?
I think the Green Man is a pagan symbol, and he does have
Okay.
leaves and
Oh,
so
good.
I think
See,
it's,
so-
I think it's a play on that, but, yeah, and the Celtic
Yeah, well,
pagan
they
world.
did this very large installation. In 1997, the Pavilion of the Green Man was first shown at the Decorative Museum. The Green Man series, I'm just going to read you this, are profile portraits of the artists. These are the two artists as green men. And it was displayed as an illuminated chapel, roofed with leaves and walled with 27 silver photographs. The artist's face were masked by flowers and leaves and glued on with honey, and were dramatic and mysterious and enigmatic. And the two works that we have are Lemon Leaf Man and Celandine Poppy Man. Not sure which is which.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
So that this,
I
they
know.
glue the stuff on with honey.
I know.
Okay, so. I finished. I don't know, do we have time just to get some feedback here and then go upstairs? What do we want to do?
Upstairs.
Go upstairs?
Yeah.
I don't know if the museum has any feedback that they send you to say,
Evaluation.
you know, evaluations.
Yeah, we give you A+.
Thank you.
You're done.
And, you know, then a few people have talked to me. I'm doing this course in Wellfleet now called Up Close and Personal. And a few people I was talking to a few people about it. And that is a more interactive course because instead of showing 300, well, we probably had looked at about 400 images. There are about 325 in the book, and then I added them. So we looked at a lot over the last 6 weeks. But this, what I did with this course was I chose, it's a 5-week course, so I chose 5 artists from my 3 contemporary Cape Cod courses. And I themed each class. The first one was landscape, yesterday was structure, the next one is figures. And I kind of put together 5 artists that I think kind of relate or not, and we talk a lot, so it's very interactive, where we talk a lot about the art, how one compares to the other, and then I have one of the artists come in and talk about their art. So Donald Beale came in the first week, who we just saw, and Mike Wright came in yesterday. And people seem to really like that as opposed to this course where we're seeing so much, and it's hard to really look at the aesthetics, the composition, comparing how different artists do it. Mike came in yesterday, and she actually brought in 3 pieces of her work. So besides looking at now we have the opportunity to go up and see the real stuff, but in Wellfleet we don't. So by the artist, Donald, when he came in, he just came in with a thumb drive that he showed images that we projected. But I try to encourage the artist to bring actually a piece, at least one piece of work, which Mike did. She brought 3 pieces, and they were big. I mean, it's not like bringing a painting. Next week, Jackie Reeves is coming. That is on figures. So anyway, that's kind of an interesting course. A few people said they might be interested in that. I'm not sure. I have to talk to Batten about that. Anybody, before we go upstairs, comments, questions? I didn't give you much time to talk.
Well, you were trying to cover so much. I mean, it was really getting through the whole book.
Yes.
And I think you had to go at the pace you
Yeah.
did. I mean, you could just do Top of the Trees for artists you hadn't had a experience with, but the ones that you did, you were able to go deeper. So just speaking as a docent here, I think it was very helpful because it made the work kind of come alive and put the context of the book in place, and good jumping off points for many of the artists. So it was very valuable.
Oh, good. Yeah, and of course, a lot of the course I'm doing now at Wellfleet, I've interviewed all those artists. So I bring that to it, which I think, you know, I just love some of their quotes and what they had to say, and I just think that's really good. So, all right, so we can go. I think we can start down here because there's probably stuff. I didn't actually scope it out.
We'll scope.
Yeah, it looks like leather. It looks like leather. But you see, he did this half circle, and And these.
Did he find everything on the beach that he does stuff with?
Beach, or now he's in Vermont,
Okay.
Everything, the only wood he said he bought was the mahogany from the Narragansett, the windrush outside.
Okay.
Usually it's, so it doesn't cost him anything for materials.
Right.
He didn't say, but I guess he just wanted that red mahogany. And maybe. Oh, okay.
Did you remind everybody about the next possibility for the class?
I was mentioning about the one at Wellfleet.
Okay, so we are going to do that?
Well, yeah, I guess we can.
Okay.
You can see if people want it. I might restructure it a little. So,
Anytime you can have artists come and interact with
yeah.
it's great.
And maybe I would have different artists come.
Okay.
I mean, I could do the exact same course.
So I have the enrollment list, and so I'll send everybody an email just reminding you about the class. And
This was a 5-week course in Wellfleet.
okay.
And I might redistribute the group, make different artists, and I would probably, Wellfleet was very nice in giving the artists honorariums.
Okay.
I just hate to ask artists to do things
For free.
for free.
Right.
But I might ask different artists to come in. I would maybe refigure the course, but the course is called Up Close and Personal. The texture. And he works on canvas, he works on wood. So he can really play a lot, because he's not just working on canvas which would break or tear. So the canvas is on wood, and so he's scraping and you can see all the texture that he creates. He can draw a figure without a model. That's how good, and I mean, that's a beautifully proportioned figure.
But only redheads. Or heads, I don't know. Whatever.
He said even if they're not her, they are her because of the red. His current wife is redhead. He was married to Vicky Tomeko. Yeah. People know that. I guess it was a bit of a scandal, but anyway.
I'm sorry, Debbie, I missed what you just said.
Mark wants the scandal.
All the voices went down.
Although it's been printed, and I think I put it in the book because he had a little a show, I think in Cambridge, and there was a catalog, and they talked, and she was quoted, his wife. So I'm not really, I mean, this is not unauthorized, it's actually in print.
Yeah.
And I didn't print it, I mean, I didn't write it. And she said they met and it was like, isn't it?
But is this the current?
I think it's his third one.
So the third wife is the one that had this chemistry with him?
Yes.
Because the weird thing was we had a show with him here, and one of his pieces was up, and very much like this, the redhead. And his wife, I assume it was his wife, was with him, and she had red hair.
Right.
And I'm looking at the painting. It was very uncomfortable because she looked just like her.
Yeah.
It's very ghostly, like, ask anything.
Oh, I didn't have to ask. It was clear that was her.
And apparently when they met, it was like kismet. It was even, it was fire. It was like, and the fire is still
Burning.
Very young.
One of the
Very
things,
young.
I interviewed him in 1985. He was, because he had already had his degree in nuclear engineering, and then, and so he was 40 years old, and he had just finished his fellowship at the Fine Arts Works, and that's when he got picked for the Guggenheim show out of 2,000 artists. And he was painting just like this. You saw it in the film. That would have been that big nude that he was painting. So
And then I've interviewed him, I don't know, at least a half a dozen times through the years. And at one point when he came back to Truro, he went to New York and he came back to Truro, and maybe he was closer to 50 at that point. And he said, I said, well, your painting hasn't changed a lot. And he said, well, I wonder if I'm old and gray, if it will. And now he's what, he was born in 1945, so he's 55, he's 71. And he's still painting the same way.
But the wands keep getting there.
It's harder to get inspired.
My grandson just started MIT.
Yes,
I hope he ends up like this.
That's,
And he's been
yeah.
painting like, and the one you saw on the film was is very similar. It was bigger, obviously, but it's really worked and scraped and a lot of texture. So that was 85. So we're talking about 40 years later, he's still really painting and the same subject matter.
He's a very popular teacher, isn't he, Deborah? And at the students.
He is. He's terrific. Yeah. He's a lot of fun. He's very animated. He's he's older now, but when I first met him, he was a handsome guy, and lots of fun to be with, lots of fun to talk to. He talks about the tension in his work, but no, you don't feel that. He's just real easy. And, I told you how the museum got that. I mean, he just even made it. Yeah.
I just noticed it has those shower or mirror hangers around the edge. Is that
Yes.
is that as almost as if it's supposed to be a bathroom type of?
Yes.
So that's not because it's supposed to have a glass in front or something?
No. And also, some of his paintings, remember we talked about being like a voyeur? Some of his paintings, he'll put a piece of plexiglass here. And the way he's done it, it's almost like you are a voyeur looking in at a very private, intimate. And it is really all about these relationships between men and women, and a lot of it is sexual. He says intellectual too.
Deborah, let me ask you this. The fine arts people there are artists who don't care if they sell. He would be selling much or does.
Oh, I think he does. And at one point he had a gallery in New York. I don't know if he still does. But I read you what he said. He said painting he just discounts. I remember when he was chosen for the Guggenheim show, we talked about it. He said, he was very modest about it. You know what? He said one or two curators picked me out of 2,000. Somebody else would have picked other people. It's really subjective. And he said this, I guess maybe the last time I interviewed, that, art is serious, but the art market isn't serious. And it really is about how well you can market your stuff. And some people are really good at it, and other people, and I think he lives in North Adams now. He's not in New York, where, that would be a place for him to be. And his paintings sell for, pretty good prices.
I just wondered if you felt that he paints for himself, as many artists do. They don't pay for
No, he paints to, he paints to, he doesn't do anything else. He teaches. Yeah. So it is, it is certainly a survival thing.
There he is now.
Yes. Right. Well, I saw him in the movie, he was a younger man.
Younger, very
His next inspiration.
Yeah, and he's very handsome. He's blue eyes, really good jawline, very good. Never hurts.
Let's see,
My relationship was just